Let me introduce our speaker. The Honorable Nathaniel R. Jones is a graduate of both the Youngstown University undergraduate and the law school. He served in the armed forces in World War II. I'm still trying to figure out how such a young man served in World War II and have all these accomplishments, but I'll let him explain that perhaps. Before he became the Assistant U.S. Attorney and Assistant General Counsel to the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which we all know today as the Kerner Commission. And then as a General Counsel of the NAACP. In 1979, he was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, where he served until his retirement in 2002. He's an internationally renowned civil rights activist. Judge Jones helped abolish apartheid in South Africa, assisted in the drafting of the new constitution there, and conferring with Nelson Mandela and others. Judge Jones currently a counsel for the law firm of Blank Rome LLP, which he's joined in 2002. From December 2006 to June of 2011, he served as the firm's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. He's an honorary co-chair and director of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, where he now lives, after serving as co-chair until its opening in August 2004. He has taught at several law schools throughout the United States and is the holder of 19 honorary degrees. Judge Jones has been inducted into the Ohio Civil Rights Hall of Fame, the National Bar Association Hall of Fame, and then his list of other accomplishments, awards, and honors is way too long for us to read out today. But let's just suffice to say that he is eminently capable of talking about the subject we've got today, and we are honored and privileged to have him be our guest speaker for lunch.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Just as I was about to be introduced, I was engaging in a very interesting conversation, and I find I'm much better sitting and chatting than I am on my feet giving a speech, especially after lunch when I'm sure many people would just as soon take a nap. But I am delighted that today's commemoration is a giant step toward rectifying, or at least providing a balance, by highlighting the outstanding national leadership of Governor Otto Kerner. A leadership he provided at a time when our nation was being torn asunder. For me to have been able to be a part of this noble effort, the effort that Governor Kerner led, was indeed a highlight of my life. And to share in this great occasion that you have afforded to me is to do me great honor. Since I was first invited to discuss with you the work of the Kerner Commission, I have been pondering an approach that would describe how Governor Kerner and those who were associated with that mission were able to effectively redirect the attention of Americans away from what I considered simple-minded reasons for the urban violence to the complexities that actually undergirded the actual causes. As I pondered that, I came across a recently published account of the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission, as you know, that studied the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Its description of that process was in less than flattering terms. And it led me to reflect on and to contrast the picture painted by the author of that book with the enduring worthiness of the Kerner Commission and its distinguished chairman, Governor Otto Kerner. It was the leadership skills of Governor Kerner that accomplished the miraculous task of redirecting minds of the other 10 independent, tough-minded, diverse individuals whom President Lyndon B. Johnson asked to undertake that monumental task, to the reality of the 60s that stirred this nation. As an assistant general counsel to that body, I was at the very heart of the Commission's activities and saw firsthand the expertise and the skill and the deftness with which Governor Kerner dislodged his colleagues from their early predispositions to reach a general consensus as to the causations and to offer a set of solutions to the nation. A glance at the persons President Johnson selected to serve with Governor Kerner provides, I think, an indication of the gravity with which he regarded the situation. Picked as vice chairman was John Lindsay, mayor of New York, who at that time was a Republican. Senator Fred Harris of Oklahoma, a Democrat. Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, a Republican. Congressman William McCullough of Ohio, a Republican, and Congressman James Corman of California, who was a Democrat. Catherine Peden, Commissioner of Commerce of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, a Democrat. Roy Wilkins, Executive Director of the NAACP, whose political identification was never publicly revealed, but I think he was a Democrat. I.W. Abel, President of the United Steelworkers of America. I have a hunch he was probably a Democrat. And Charles B. Tex Thornton, Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of Litton Industries. I have no reason to know his political identity, but I have a hunch, based upon our discussions and debates within the commission, that he was probably a Republican. And finally, Herbert Jenkins, Chief of Police of Atlanta, who offered no particular political identity. But the urban crisis and the urban uprisings occurred after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, and after major court decisions had been handed down and landmark civil rights laws regarding employment, education, and housing had been enacted. And the country appeared, in the eyes of many, to be taking steps to remove the lasting racial barriers. If that's so, why then, many ask, was there so much unrest? Why was there such an anger and impatience, and yes, violence in America's urban areas? Governors, mayors, and President Johnson himself were puzzled. These were some of the questions that prompted the president to seek answers through the appointment of a national commission. Now, Washington's penchant for attention-grabbing names ignored the official title set forth in the executive order, which was the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. And the media hastened to dub the group the Riot Commission. But reality soon set in, and that shorthand label of a Riot Commission gave way to the more appropriate and lasting shorthand, the term and name, the Kerner Commission. The charge that President Johnson issued to this commission in his executive order with regards to the riots and the disturbances that were ripping America's urban areas was threefold. What happened? Why did it happen? What must be done to keep it from happening again? Seeking answers to this was no easy feat, given the incendiary rumors that were sweeping across the country. Law enforcement officials and the media pegged such easy targets as the rioters as, quote, outside agitators, unquote, communists, and radicals of one form or another. Governor Kerner early on urged members of the commission to accept the wise counsel of some of his other members, such as Roy Wilkins and Mayor Lindsay and Senator Fred Harris, and take walking trips into the ghettos that had been ignited and were aflame. This led to a commission decision to dispatch, after the return of these commissioners, to dispatch full teams of fact finders into the ghettos in order to gather data and information which would provide answers to President Johnson's first two charges of finding out what and why. Governor Kerner kept the commission and its investigators focused on those goals of what and why, while at the same time remaining mindful of the need to come up with solutions. The commissioners' probes that preceded the number of hearings that we held were deep, and the recommendations provided a set of profound recommendations indeed. A roadmap for guiding America away from the abyss that led to the commission's creation was the roadmap. And that roadmap remains relevant even to this day. But before that roadmap could be drawn, the profile of the rioters and their grievances and their perceptions had to be understood. And that was the job of the staff and the team of the commission. But there was great difficulty in winning the confidence of residents in the urban areas. For without their cooperation, our teams and the commission encountered great difficulty in obtaining the facts that would educate the commission as to the reasons for the deep unrest that prompted the explosions. Rumors and accusations leveled at urban residents by law enforcement officials at the local level and even the media created suspicions that the commission staff members, the staff members themselves, were actually CIA agents or FBI agents. With that perception having taken root in many of our urban areas, our first challenge was to establish credibility and trust. For without that, there could be no effective communication. Governor Kerner's keen understanding of the reality of urban life was a key factor that resulted from and led to the walking tours that were conducted in our urban areas. And it was those walking tours that built bridges of trust. It is difficult today without context. And I was so pleased to hear the discussion this morning because it did provide the context. It took us back to a period of time that many of us have forgotten, 45 years. And that was when the report was issued. It was issued on March 1st, 1968. And as we go back to that time, we can comprehend the significance of the changes that have since taken place, both in this nation and in the world. Essential to such an understanding is an awareness of the climate existing at that time. The time will not permit me to provide specifics of the precipitating events that took place in such cities as Detroit, in Newark, in Cincinnati, in Chicago, and Watts, and Los Angeles. For instance, if I just cite these numbers, you'll understand why I'm just skipping over those particular events. In 1967, there were 24 disorders in 23 different cities. In Detroit and Newark alone, a total of 66 persons were killed and hundreds wounded. And in addition, property damage exceeded $33 million. And after the beginning of the Kerner Commission's probes, we received incident reports from another 150 cities of a similar nature, which we could not, in the interest of time, document. But as we gather here in Springfield now to reflect on the work of Governor Kerner and the commission that bears his name, it is well to recall the words of a son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, spoken to the Congress in the midst of the Civil War on December 1st, 1862. And he said, quote, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history," unquote. And many years later, a philosopher named George Santayana echoed Lincoln's words, those same words which remain relevant today. And I quote further, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Now here is what the Kerner Commission taught us about the past and what must be done to avoid a recurrence. And I quote from the report, "What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it." Since my days with the Kerner Commission, I went on to serve as general counsel of the NAACP, and in that role, as a successor to Thurgood Marshall, who put together the principal strategy for overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, and for implementing Brown v. Board of Education. We put together a strategy for attacking segregation in the North, or for bringing the jurisprudence of the South that led to the desegregation in the South to our northern communities. And we established that in our northern communities, much of what I learned as a member of the Kerner Commission staff, much of the dry rot that existed and still exists in many respects in our communities, were present. And as we demonstrated that the racial isolation we see in our north, the segregated schools, the segregated housing, stem from decisions of public officials, state acts, public policy, thus lending and making local officials in the North liable to the same remedies that the court held the South was required to submit to. But when those strategies were attempted in the North, suddenly they became transformed. They were no longer desegregation cases. They were no longer anti-discrimination cases. They were busing cases. They were reverse discrimination cases. The very things that gave rise to the impatience and the anger of the 50s and the 60s that gave rise to the riots. Now, the teachings of the Kerner Commission with regard to that history that it dealt with was made a part of the record in the school cases that I was involved in litigating. And yet, the pushback that was received, led by the Detroit school case called Bradley versus Milliken, prompted Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was on the Supreme Court, to warn Americans of what the Kerner Commission had warned Americans of, that it may seem like it's convenient and good policy to divide our great metropolitan areas up into black and white, but it is a result that we will all come to resist and to regret. And that message by Thurgood Marshall rings true today as we find the Supreme Court that declares that any remedy that declares race as an appropriate component is unconstitutional. Most recently, the Supreme Court, in its voting rights case involving Texas and North Carolina, declared that the efforts to correct the voting infractions that Congress decreed should be corrected is a violation of the Constitution, thus flipping the 14th Amendment on its head. And in doing that, betraying the lessons of Kerner. Now, the lessons of Kerner were based on 1,200 interviews conducted by teams, arrest records in 22 cities, and other data. We did a profile of the rioters, and the rioters mirrored what Dr. John Conant of Harvard called social dynamite. And this is how the commission described it with regard to its component. It was white racism. And white racism is essentially responsible for the explosive nature which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. Among the ingredients of this mixture are pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education and housing, black in-migration and white exodus, which have produced a massive and growing concentrations of impoverished Negroes in our major cities. The black ghettos where segregation and poverty converge. Those and other findings and conclusions of the report sent shockwaves across the land. Never before had a presidential commission acknowledged the existence of white racism and dared to charge America with being responsible for it. Yet, any who looked honestly at America's history, going back to slavery and the Dred Scott decision of 1857, as the commission did, had to acknowledge that racism was injected into America's bloodstream by the pernicious institution of slavery that reinforced the Supreme Court decision that described slaves as subhumans with no rights that white people were bound to respect. That was the essence of white racism. What the commission's findings confronted and identified was the viability of that legacy of slavery and the Dred Scott decision. Yet in its recommendations, the commission held out hope for continued positive change. It was painfully clear, said the commission, that the disparities of neglect and educational deficits, if addressed, could be overcome, but what was required then is what is required now. Earlier, I quoted an admonition from a son of Illinois, President Lincoln, to not forget lessons from the past. What we find in the Kerner Report is a lesson from another son of Illinois, Governor Otto Kerner, a lesson that warns that Americans are becoming two societies, black, white, separate, and unequal. And now a third son of Illinois, who has ascended to the office of president of this great nation as its first black president, Barack Obama, seeks to redress that history that President Lincoln and Governor Kerner urged we not forget. But there are disappointing signs of an unwillingness on the part of a small, hardcore group of Americans, an unwillingness to learn from this past. In yesterday's New York Times, in a column by John Harwood, he states what I call the most recent reminder of the basic conclusion of the Kerner Report. And we must bear in mind the basic conclusion of the Kerner Report is that we are becoming two societies, black, white, separate and unequal, but that's an admonition that has not been heeded. I still insist that the words of the Kerner Report can help this generation if only we will listen and reread them. And the efforts of the current son of Illinois, who occupies the White House, is offering them once again. He is trying to show the way. But of all the words in the report, the following paragraph continues to strongly resonate from the days of 1968 to now and into the future. The Kerner words are these, I quote, "Only a commitment to national action on an unprecedented scale can shape a future compatible with the historical ideals of American society. The major need is to generate new will to tax ourselves to the extent necessary to meet the vital needs of the nation," unquote. As one who was there when these words were drafted, I can say to you, those words constitute what to me is the Otto Kerner credo. And we must all work to keep that credo alive. Thank you very much.